Okay, so this is another history video, and to continue my Prime Ministerial series. If you've just joined my channel, I've been going through every British Prime Minister from Walpole up to Cameron, and I'm well over halfway now. I make a range of videos on other issues. Feel free to check out my introduction video on that. So we're up to Prime Minister number 35, H. Asquith, Herbert Henry Asquith. Who often went simply by his initials H. Asquith. That's how he described himself. Um, Briefly, before I get onto that, I made a minor mistake in the last video on Campbell Bannerman, which one of my subscribers pointed out, and that was that I mentioned Bannerman was the last Prime Minister to die in office. He did die on 10 Downing Street, but actually he'd been out of office for, I believe, 18 days. So if there is any little mistakes you notice that I make, I don't mind if you point those out. I take full responsibility for any mistakes, albeit unintended. And occasionally I may misread something or give information that isn't quite accurate. That's not deliberate, of course. That's a slip of the tongue or something that I've unintentionally negated to mention. Um, so if you do notice me making mistakes, I don't mind people pointing that out. Asquith succeeded Campbell Bannerman as Prime Minister in the year 1908, and he served 8 years until 1916, um, which made him one of the longest serving Prime Ministers of the 20th century. Um, in fact, until 1988, he had been the longest continuously serving Prime Minister until Thatcher beat that record. This is a quote attributed to Asquith. Youth would be an ideal state if it came later in life. Like a lot of these quotes from the Downing Street page are rather trivial. Asquith is an interesting man. I've actually just seen a radio broadcast from him that is one of the earliest recorded voices of a British Prime Minister. It dates from 1909. It's in reference to the famous budget of that year, and it's quite clear. And there's an interesting bit towards the end. You can sort of make out like him saying, "Is that it done?" or something like that. He was still not quite accustomed to this. There is an older recording of Gladstone, but that's very, very hard to make out. But the one of Gladstone's thought to be the first prime ministerial voice to be recorded. As for the first prime minister to be filmed, there's some speculation that would be Salisbury, but I haven't been able to find any hard evidence for that. There's a lot of silent footage available of these early prime ministers, but as for the first one, I'm not sure. It might have been Salisbury. The information isn't so readily available. So I'm just going to get straight into the biographical from the 10 Downing Street page. It's quite lengthy, so bear with me. Herbert Henry Asquith was the son of a Yorkshire clothing manufacturer. He was educated at the City of London School and Balliol College, Oxford, where he became president of the Union and was called to the bar in 1876, which of course is a legal term. He was actually born, to be precise about that. He was born at Morley, which is now part of the City of Leeds, West Yorkshire. Um, and he was born in 1852. Um, in 1886, Asquith was elected as Liberal MP for East Fife, despite the limitations of being a young widower with 5 children. He had married Helen Mellor, but she died from typhoid. He was a strong believer in free trade, home rule for Ireland, and social reform, which were all vital issues of the day. With his intellectual gifts and skill with public speaking, he was quick to make his mark on the Commons. Despite lack of previous ministerial experience, he became Home Secretary under Gladstone in 1892 and then again under Rosebery. Out of office for a decade from 1895, he returned to his barrister's practice, but also toured the country making influential speeches in favour of free trade. In 1905, Asquith, a stocky man with clean-cut features, became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the new Liberal government. He introduced higher taxes on unearned income, which helped pay for another innovation, pensions for senior citizens over 70 years old. In 1908, he became Prime Minister following the resignation of Henry Campbell Bannerman. That was the amendment I made. Campbell Bannerman didn't die in office, but he resigned due to ill health. Asquith took on the House of Lords, which often blocked reforming Liberal bills, preventing them becoming law. The Lords unwisely rejected his Chancellor David Lloyd George's budget of 1909, which is a very famous budget. Some actually attribute that to Asquith more than Lloyd George. And the December 1910 election was billed as a referendum on this Lords versus the Commons issues. That's why it became known as the People's Budget. Asquith had no overall majority after the election, but it gave him the public support he needed. He introduced the Parliament Bill, which stripped the Lords of any veto over money bills or public legislation. The bill became law in 1911, and the Lords were forced into passing it by the threat that hundreds of new Liberal peers would be created if they did not. As Prime Minister, Asquith presided over a period of national upheaval, with the issues of Irish Home Rule and women's suffrage dominating the era. He also brought Britain into the First World War. So this is a famous speech by Charles Grey, "The lights are going out all over Europe." Charles Grey was Asquith's Foreign Secretary. Um, so Asquith was certainly in office for a very turbulent period of time. Just to continue that, let's just give you a bit of the context. Um, Asquith, excuse me, um, to maximize government support, he formed a coalition in 1915, but this government was unsuccessful and unpopular as the war was going badly. The press blamed Asquith's procrastination for the deadlock on the battlefields. In fact, a young Churchill was part of his cabinet, I believe. Churchill served as Home Secretary at one point around this time. Asquith appeared silent-eyed when he accepted Lloyd George's suggestion that a small cabinet committee directed the war, to the exclusion of the Prime Minister himself. His following change of mind led to a rift with Lloyd George, which forced Asquith to resign in December 1916, on the same day as his Chancellor resigned. The success of Lloyd George's government consigned Asquith to the political wilderness, a situation made worse by the loss of his seat and those of many of his allies in 1918. He had enjoyed a very odd position, as he stubbornly remained leader of the Liberal Party despite lacking a seat. 2 years later he won a seat in a by-election but would not govern again. In 1925 Asquith was granted the title of the Earl of Oxford and elevated to the House of Lords. He died of a stroke in 1928 and he was 75. He died at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire, and his tomb can be found there. I believe that's where his tomb is. So, from this we can summarise that Asquith had a very turbulent period in office. It has been argued that sometimes Lloyd George is given credit for some things that Asquith actually laid the foundation for. So perhaps Asquith is unfairly overlooked in light of Lloyd George. They were both great Liberal statesmen, and Asquith certainly ranks among the higher tier of British Prime Ministers. But the absolute quagmire of World War One, and something that became known as the Shells Crisis, when basically the British Expeditionary Force ran out of ammunition in the summer of 1915, I believe, and that's when Lloyd George really took the helm, was a disaster for Asquith. There was also the disaster of the Gallipoli campaign. This was at the point, by 1915, they realised the war was really not going to be over by Christmas, and it was really turning into a dismal affair. Thousands of young men were coming back either killed or maimed. Not just young men, entire generations. This has an absolutely profound impact on Britain. I mean, it had a profound impact on all countries involved, but from a British perspective, this was incomparable to any conflict we'd previously seen. This is exactly 100 years ago, so Asquith was Prime Minister a century ago to this day. There was a lot of domestic upheaval at that time. The Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916, I believe that was at the very last year of Asquith's administration. So the increasing threat from Irish nationalism, or whatever way you want to look at that. Also, there were several domestic situations. There was something known as the Tottenham outrage, which was basically a huge crime spree in London. It was armed robbery and double murder, which took place in Tottenham in 1909, and in Walthamstow. And it was basically a manhunt through the city of London. Very interesting article on that. The year before, there'd been the siege of Sydney Street. Um, may have been the year afterwards, in fact. The Crippen case was in 1910. The Titanic sank in 1912. All of this happened in Asquith's administration, so he certainly had one of the most eventful premierships. How he handled it, of course, is a matter of judgment. I personally think that Asquith probably done his level best based on the exceptional situations he was facing. So from that point of view, I would say Asquith should rank as quite a high prime minister. Probably not in the top three, but certainly I'd be sympathetic to putting Asquith in the top 10 of British prime ministers. Um, if there's any information I've left out there, it's unintentional. Among his descendants, incidentally, is the actress Helena Bonham Carter. Um, the Asquith family was quite well off. They were quite a prestigious family. Um, yeah, the siege of Sydney Street actually occurred in 1911. But basically, this was a very eventful period in British history. So I'll leave it there. That's Herbert Henry Asquith.